The fields of northern France are silent for a moment, the calm before another thunderclap of war. It is late summer 1944. Morning haze rolls over the hedgerows, carrying the scent of burnt fuel and wet earth. A column of Panther tanks crawls through the mist, their broad tracks crushing the soaked soil beneath. Inside one of them, a confident German gunner smirks as a shell clangs harmlessly off their sloped frontal armor. Just another Sherman trying its luck. From a distant ridge, an American M18 Hellcat waits. The gunner adjusts his sight, loads a single round one unlike the others. It's shorter, heavier, with a sharp tungsten heart glinting faintly in the light. The shot cracks. A faint whistle, then a burst of light and smoke. The Panther jerks violently, its armor pierced clean through. Flames erupt from its engine deck. In a nearby command truck, German officers stare in disbelief. Moments ago, they laughed at the idea that American guns could ever penetrate a Panther. Now they are silent, because something new has just arrived on the battlefield. By 1943, the German war machine stood at the peak of its armored evolution. Across Europe, from the ruins of Kharkov to the hedgerows of Normandy, one word spread through Allied tank crews like a cursed panther: sleek, angular, and menacing. The Panzerkampfwagen VW Panther was Germany's answer to the shock of encountering the Soviet T-34. It combined firepower, speed, and armor in a way no Allied tank could yet match. Its 75mm WK-42 L-70 gun could penetrate almost any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Its frontal armor, 80mm thick and sharply sloped, turned enemy shells into harmless sparks. Reports from the Eastern Front told the same story over and over. Soviet 76mm guns shattered against the Panther's glasses. On the Western Front, British and American shells ricocheted away, leaving tankers with one grim choice: flank it or die trying. For the Allies, 1943 and early 1944 were years of frustration. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of American armored forces, was a reliable machine, easy to repair, easy to build, but hopelessly outmatched against German heavy armor. Crews nicknamed their tanks Ronsons after the lighter brand, lights every time. Behind the front lines, American ordnance engineers faced a mounting crisis. Reports from the field piled up describing direct hits on Panthers and Tigers that had no effect. A Sherman's 75mm M61 APC round could barely penetrate the thinner sides of a Panther, even at close range. The new 76mm gun improved matters slightly, but not enough. The U.S. Army's tank destroyer units, fielding the faster M18 Hellcat and M10 Wolverine, were meant to outmaneuver and ambush German armor, yet their standard ammunition simply couldn't match the thick steel they faced. To the men in Washington and Aberdeen proving ground, this wasn't just a tactical problem, it was a psychological one. Allied crews were losing faith in their machines. Tank commanders reported that some men hesitated to engage Panthers head-on. Meanwhile, German generals grew arrogant. They saw their new armored divisions with Panthers and Tigers leading the charge as invincible. At tactical briefings, Allied reports about improved American shells were often dismissed as propaganda. But beneath that confidence, a race was quietly unfolding. The Allies had begun experimenting with high-velocity, subcaliber ammunition, a radical concept involving smaller, denser cores encased in lightweight shells. These rounds could achieve extraordinary muzzle velocities, focusing all their kinetic energy on a single needle-like point. The idea wasn't new. Both Germany and Britain had conducted similar research before the war. But the Americans took it further. They sought to create a round that could finally pierce the Panther's front armor even from the standard 76mm gun of a Sherman or Hellcat. To achieve this, they needed something far harder than steel. They turned to tungsten carbide, one of the hardest substances known to man. Its density allowed a smaller projectile to retain immense energy and resist shattering on impact. Thus began the secret development of a new kind of ammunition, the high-velocity armor-piercing round, or HVAP. In 1943, early tests at Aberdeen showed astonishing results. The new M93 HVAP round could reach muzzle velocities over 3,400 feet per second, nearly 40% faster than standard armor-piercing shells. Against a captured Panther plate, it punched through at ranges that had once been unthinkable. For the first time, There was hope that American guns could go toe-to-toe with Germany's best. But there was a problem. Tungsten was scarce. Every shell required a solid tungsten core, and the Allied war effort already needed tungsten for cutting tools, aircraft production, and armor manufacturing. There was simply not enough to equip every tank. Still, the Ordnance Department pressed forward. They would start small, just a few thousand rounds, and send them to selected units heading for Europe. Units whose mission would soon test this new weapon under real fire. And as the summer of 1944 approached, with the Allies preparing to storm Normandy, the first batches of HVAP rounds were loaded aboard ships bound for England, unknown to the German generals who still laughed at Allied shells. The age of invincibility for the Panther was about to end. By the spring of 1944, crates marked HVAP and experimental began leaving the U.S. mainland. Each contained only a handful of rounds, usually fewer than 10 per vehicle. The reason was simple: tungsten scarcity. The United States had access to limited tungsten sources from China, Bolivia, and Portugal, but the material was already stretched thin across countless war industries. So, HVAP was never meant to be a standard issue. It was precision ammunition, reserved for the most capable crews and most dangerous encounters. The Ordnance Department issued the first batches to tank destroyer battalions and selected armored divisions equipped with the new 76mm guns, particularly the M18 Hellcat and M4A176W Sherman. The message was clear: use it only when absolutely necessary. Each round was a marvel of wartime engineering. The M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing round, featured a tungsten carbide core sheathed in a lightweight aluminum body with a steel ballistic cap for aerodynamic stability. When fired, the lightweight shell reached extreme velocity over 3,400 feet per second, compared to 2,600 for a standard armor-piercing shell. That speed meant one thing: penetration. Tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground and Fort Knox showed the M93 could penetrate 120 mil of armor at 500 yards, enough to go clean through a Panther's glacis or even threaten a Tiger's turret front under the right angle. For Allied crews who'd spent months watching shells bounce off German tanks, the results were nothing short of revolutionary. Yet early field tests were cautious. Before deployment in Normandy, American ordnance teams arranged controlled trials using captured Panther tanks in England. On a clear morning in May 1944, a small group of officers, engineers, and tank crews gathered at a range near Lulworth. One Sherman lined up its 76mm gun. The first shot of a standard AP shell struck and ricocheted, leaving only a scorch mark. Then came the M93. The gun thundered. The tungsten core screamed across 800 yards, slamming into the same spot. This time, the plate fractured open. The projectile burst through the other side, leaving a clean hole the size of a fist. The observers stood in silence. For months, they had heard of German armor superiority. Now, for the first time, they saw it defeated by a single round. Still, skepticism remained. Would these results hold up in the chaos of real combat under mud, heat, and smoke? The opportunity to find out would come soon enough. In June 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the first HVAP-equipped units rolled onto French soil. Among them were elements of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, supporting the U.S. 4th Armored Division. Their M18 Hellcats, built for speed and ambush tactics, carried a few of these experimental rounds in each vehicle's rack. But in the first weeks after D-Day, there was little chance to use them. The bocage country of Normandy favored close-range fighting and ambushes, where even standard AP rounds could be deadly from the flank. HVAP's full potential awaited open terrain and open combat. That chance came in August 1944, during the breakout from Normandy and the battles across northern France. Allied armored spearheads raced eastward, clashing with retreating German formations. It was here, near Ericourt and Nancy, that the first confirmed HVAP kills were recorded. Tank destroyer crews learned fast. They realized HVAP rounds flew flatter, hit harder, and could reach out to ranges where German gunners thought they were safe. Suddenly, Panthers that had once dominated duels were being destroyed at a distance. Reports began filtering back to headquarters. Panther destroyed frontally range 800 yards of new 76mm HVAP ammunition. German officers were stunned. At first, they assumed Allied gunners had scored lucky hits or caught Panthers in weak spots. But soon the pattern became undeniable. Tanks that had previously shrugged off direct hits were now being pierced, often with catastrophic results. In captured field diaries and intelligence reports, German commanders expressed disbelief. One report from late 1944 noted, "Enemy projectiles appear to have new penetrative capacity. Armor previously considered invulnerable now fails under repeated hits." The laughter had begun to fade. By autumn, the Ordnance Department rushed to ship more HVAP rounds to Europe. But production couldn't keep up with demand. Some units received only a few per tank per week. Crews often hoarded them, saving HVAP for the big ones, meaning Tigers and Panthers. Still, word spread quickly among tankers. A new kind of shell had arrived, and it worked. For the first time since 1943, Allied crews began believing they could fight the German Panzers head-on. And as the war rolled toward the bitter winter of 1944, HVAP would soon face its greatest test in the dense forests of the Ardennes, against the last great German offensive of the war. For American tank crews, the inside of a Sherman often felt like a trap. The armor was thin, the silhouette high, and the German guns unforgiving. Many entered battle with a quiet acceptance that if they met a Panther head-on, they might not come back. But that changed the first time an HVAP round worked. Veterans of the 704th and 602nd tank destroyer battalions later recalled the moment they saw a Panther ignite after a single 76mm shot. One gunner described it simply, "We didn't believe it until we saw the fire." In that instant, the sense of helplessness that haunted Allied crews began to fade. Tankers started to trust their weapons again. They no longer had to rely solely on flanking or airstrikes. Their guns could finally do the job. HVAP didn't just penetrate armor. It pierced fear itself. The knowledge that one or two tungsten rounds could destroy a Panther restored confidence in the crews who had been fighting at a disadvantage for years. That change in morale rippled across the front. Crews began requesting HVAP by name. Officers marked crates for Panther engagements only. And while they still respected the power of the German tanks, they no longer faced them with resignation but with resolve. Before HVAP, German tanks controlled the distance. Panthers and Tigers could destroy a Sherman long before its gun reached effective range. Allied tankers were forced into close-range ambushes. Relying on numbers and maneuver rather than raw power, HVAP changed that equation overnight. Its blistering velocity flattened the projectile's trajectory, allowing accurate fire at 1,000 meters or more. Tank destroyer units, especially those using the M18 Hellcat, could finally exploit their mobility. They didn't have to close the gap. They could strike first from concealment and withdraw before the enemy located them. The battlefield dynamic shifted from defense to initiative. Reports from the Lorraine campaign in late 1944 described tank destroyer platoons engaging German armor from ranges previously deemed impossible. One Hellcat platoon leader wrote in his after-action report, "At Pan 200 yards, our first HVAP round went through the Panther's front plate. The enemy tank burned immediately." German commanders began to notice that their units were being picked off from unexpected distances. Crews who once felt safe behind thick armor started doubting their protection. HVAP gave Allied tankers something far greater than penetration. It gave them range advantage, something they had not enjoyed since 1940. When the first reports of Panther and Tiger losses to Allied guns reached German headquarters, disbelief was the common reaction. In mid-1944, Panzer Lehr division officers mocked American tank weapons in their internal briefings, claiming the Sherman's gun could not harm a Panther from the front at any range. For months, this was largely true. Then came the sudden battlefield losses that defied logic. Panthers destroyed from head-on by single hits, armor penetrations through zones. Previously considered immune captured German crewmen often attributed these incidents to lucky shots or defective armor. But intelligence files later revealed that by October 1944, German ordnance branches had begun serious investigation into new Allied ammunition types. Reports mentioned Kern munition core ammunition with unknown metal content. They were describing tungsten. The laughter that once filled German tank depots began to fade into unease. Their invincible machines were being destroyed in ways they couldn't yet explain. Panther crews started angling their tanks more cautiously, avoiding open duels where HVAP-equipped Shermans or Hellcats could exploit their new reach. Confidence eroded not from numbers but from uncertainty, because once the enemy begins to doubt his armor, he begins to doubt his war. Inside every HVAP round lay a secret the Germans hadn't expected: tungsten carbide. Dense, heavy, and nearly unbreakable, it gave the projectile its penetrating power. The Americans called it the M93 high-velocity armor-piercing round, but its true strength came from physics. The round used a subcaliber core much smaller than the gun's bore, encased in a lightweight aluminum shell. When fired, the aluminum shed away in flight, leaving the tungsten core to strike the target at extraordinary speed. At the moment of impact, the kinetic energy focused onto a pinpoint area small enough to shear through hardened armor like glass. Unlike standard steel shells, HVAP didn't rely on explosive filler. It relied on raw momentum. The faster it flew, the deadlier it became. But behind this marvel of engineering was a hidden cost. Tungsten was the new gold. The United States struggled to acquire enough of it, competing with Britain and the Soviet Union for limited global reserves. Every round fired meant less material for cutting tools and aircraft engines. Even so, the technology marked a turning point in wartime science. It showed that victory wasn't just about who had the biggest gun, but who could make their bullets smarter. HVAP was the physical embodiment of Allied ingenuity, forged not in myth, but in metallurgy. When HVAP results reached the upper echelons of Allied command, reactions were mixed. Some officers were thrilled that finally, American tanks had the power to fight the German Panthers on equal footing. Others worried that tungsten supply constraints would limit the advantage. In September 1944, U.S. Army Ordnance reports noted that production could not meet frontline demand. Commanders were instructed to ration HVAP strictly for engagements involving Panthers, Tigers, or heavy self-propelled guns. As a result, logistics officers became gatekeepers of battlefield power, deciding which units would have the rare silver bullets. General Omar Bradley, reviewing armored operations after Normandy, emphasized the need for technological parity. Our tanks must fight on equal terms. Courage alone cannot pierce armor. Meanwhile, on the German side, alarm was spreading. Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, demanded reports explaining how Panthers were being destroyed frontally by 76mm guns. German engineers examined captured HVAP fragments and confirmed the presence of tungsten, a material they themselves had pioneered in early Piazzurita-40 ammunition, but had abandoned due to critical shortages. The realization stung. The very technology they had once used was now being turned against them and perfected. In a 1945 post-war debrief, a former German ordnance officer summarized the shock. "We thought the Americans were years behind. Suddenly, their shells did what ours no longer could." It was a quiet acknowledgement that the arms race of innovation had shifted decisively. By late 1944, a strange reversal had taken hold across the European battlefields. For years, German tank crews had fought with supreme confidence, knowing that Allied guns were largely ineffective frontally. But as HVAP spread, that certainty began to crumble. Reports from Panzer Brigades 106 and 111 during the Lorraine battles describe unexpected losses and shaken morale. Crewmen began referring to black-tipped shells, the telltale mark of HVAP ammunition as Teufelskugeln, devil bullets. Allied intelligence later noted intercepted radio chatter, in which German units warned each other to avoid frontal exposure against the fast-firing American guns. For the first time, it was the Germans adjusting tactics out of fear of Allied firepower. On the Allied side, the psychological change was just as dramatic, but in the opposite direction. Crews who had once hesitated to engage now hunted. Tank destroyer platoons planned deliberate ambushes, knowing they could win even frontal duels if they had HVAP aboard. This reversal in confidence cannot be overstated. It didn't just change outcomes, it changed behavior. Armored warfare is as much about belief as it is about steel. And in the winter of 1944, belief had finally shifted toward the Allies. The transformation was complete. What began as a desperate experiment in metallurgy had become a weapon that altered morale, tactics, and command thinking across the European front. And soon, in the Ardennes, amid snow, smoke, and the last great gamble of the German army, HVAP would face the ultimate test of its promise. December 1944. The Ardennes. Snow drifts between the trees, muffling the sound of engines beneath a pale, frozen sky. The Battle of the Bulge has begun. Hitler's final, desperate gamble in the West. German panzers, including hundreds of Panthers and Tigers, surge through the American lines, aiming to split the Allied front and capture Antwerp. For the first time in months, German armor once again dominates the battlefield. The Allied situation is grim. In the dense forests and narrow roads of Belgium and Luxembourg, American units fight isolated, outnumbered, and often surrounded. Many of the armored divisions caught in the onslaught are equipped with 76mm guns capable, but still outmatched by German steel. But among them are a few tank destroyer battalions carrying somewhat different HVAP rounds, rationed and carefully guarded since autumn. On December 19, 1944, near the town of Bastogne, an M18 Hellcat from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion sits in ambush along a forest road. Through the falling snow, its crew hears the distant rumble of engines. The sound grows deep, mechanical, unmistakable. Panthers. The commander steadies his binoculars. 3 dark shapes emerge from the fog, their armor glinting in the white light. The gunner loads one of the last HVAP shells. Inside the small turret, breath steams in the freezing air. Range 800 yards, the commander whispers, the gun roars. A flash, a streak, a single shot that finds the lead Panther square in the glacis. The tungsten core slices through the armor and erupts inside the fighting compartment. Flames burst through the hatches as the tank grinds to a halt. The second Panther hesitates. Another HVAP round slams through its turret ring, jamming the gun and sending fragments across the crew. Within seconds, 2 of the 3 tanks are burning. The third retreats into the forest. Reports from that day would describe it simply: enemy tanks destroyed frontally by new ammunition. Range 800-900 yards. For the Germans, it was the beginning of a grim realization that the enemy had found a way to defeat their strongest armor, even in a head-on fight. Across the front, similar encounters unfolded. In the Lorraine region near the town of Ericourt, American tank destroyers and Sherman units engaged elements of the 11th Panzer Division. Overcast skies grounded Allied aircraft, leaving the fight to tanks alone. The Germans advanced confidently, their Panthers forming the spearhead. Allied commanders ordered their units to hold fire until the range closed to under 1,000 yards. When it did, they unleashed their hidden weapon. Hellcats and Shermans fired their limited HVAP rounds first. Panthers began exploding one after another, not from the sides, but from the front. Gun sights recorded impacts that would have been impossible only months before. One American officer later wrote, "They didn't believe we could do it. We didn't either until we did." Within 2 days, more than 20 German tanks lay destroyed near Ericourt. Many were knocked out by 76mm guns firing HVAP. German reports initially attributed the losses to aircraft attack or flanking fire, refusing to accept that American guns had broken their armor. But captured tank fragments told the truth. Smooth, clean holes burned through thick steel, lined with traces of tungsten impact. By the time the weather cleared, the German armored thrust was stalling. The 2nd Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr, and 116th Panzer had suffered severe losses not from Allied bombing, but from ground fire that seemed impossibly strong. The psychological impact rippled through the ranks. Panther crews began to question their once reliable protection. Many started fighting from longer distances or avoiding frontal duels altogether. Allied tankers, sensing the shift, pressed harder. At Ericourt and Bastogne, HVAP had proven itself not just as a technological success but as a battlefield equalizer. Still, its scarcity meant not every crew could share in the triumph. Some Sherman units ran out of HVAP after only a few engagements, forced to revert to standard AP rounds. But those few moments, those few shots, had shown the impossible was now possible. And in the icy forests of Belgium, where every road was lined with wrecks, German officers began to whisper what they once mocked. The Americans could now kill Panthers from the front. In the aftermath of the Ardennes clashes, wrecked German armor littered the snow. The once feared silhouettes of Panthers and Tigers now stood silent, some gutted by direct hits to the front, others cracked open like eggshells. When German recovery teams inspected the battlefield, confusion turned to disbelief. Tank after tank bore neat circular penetrations through armor once considered invulnerable, The holes were clean, not the jagged tears caused by explosives or artillery, but precise surgical punctures. At first, many assumed Allied aircraft had struck with armor-piercing rockets, but ground crews confirmed otherwise. There were no blast signatures, no shrapnel, only tungsten traces fused into molten steel. By early January 1945, fragments of these new shells began reaching Heereswaffenamt, the German Army Weapons Office in Berlin. Metallurgical analysis confirmed their fears. The Americans were using Kern munition, tungsten cored projectiles, similar to Germany's own Pegeran 40 designs from years earlier. A secret report titled Erhöhte Durchschlagskraft der Feindmunition, increased penetration power of enemy ammunition, was circulated among senior officers. The findings were blunt. Captured specimens of 76.2 mm projectiles contain a dense metallic core of unknown alloy, assumed tungsten carbide, capable of penetrating 80 mm homogeneous armor at 1,000 meters. The conclusions shocked German ordnance experts. They had once pioneered this technology, but their own production had nearly ceased in 1943 due to catastrophic tungsten shortages. Now the Allies were using it against them and in far greater quantities than they could imagine. At forward headquarters, General Heinz Guderian received the reports with visible frustration. As Inspector General of Armored Troops, he had long warned Hitler about the danger of complacency in armor design. Now his warnings were reality. In one post-war account, a German staff officer recalled Guderian's reaction. He said only one sentence: "So, the Americans learned faster than we thought." For the German High Command, the implications were devastating. Their armored doctrine, the pride of Blitzkrieg, relied on the assumption of technical superiority. The Panthers' sloped armor and long gun had defined that dominance since Kursk. Now, both were being countered. In the West, field commanders began reporting rising losses of Panthers and even Tigers to long-range Allied fire. A dispatch from 5th Panzer Army to OKH headquarters read, "Enemy tank destroyers employing new ammunition, probable tungsten core achieve penetrations frontally at 700 1,000 meters. Recommend additional armor reinforcement or avoidance of open engagements." But it was too late for design fixes. The Reich's industry was collapsing under Allied bombing, fuel was scarce, and tungsten imports from Portugal had been cut off months earlier. For the first time since 1942, Germany faced an armored opponent it could no longer intimidate. In the front lines, the psychological shift was unmistakable. Veteran Panther crews, once confident enough to duel openly, began using defensive tactics. Tanks that had led assaults now stayed behind ridgelines, firing from concealment. Commanders ordered more ambush operations and withdrawal upon exposure, a far cry from the aggressive spirit of the early Panzer divisions. Captured documents from Panzer Lehr Division in late 1944 recorded a chilling entry. Enemy projectiles of new type cause sudden combustion of internal stores. Armor offers no safety. Crews shaken. Even among the Allies, reports of German disbelief circulated widely. American intelligence officers collected testimony from prisoners of war who described the growing unease in their ranks. One German tank commander reportedly said, "We laughed at your Shermans before. Not anymore." Back in Berlin, engineers attempted emergency countermeasures: shirts and side skirts, thicker glacis overlays, and even experimental composite plates. But none could change the reality. Germany lacked both the materials and the time. The irony was bitter. The same tungsten that once gave German shells their power had become the heart of their downfall. By February 1945, Allied officers noted a decline in aggressive German armored operations. Panthers appeared less often on the offensive, conserving fuel and avoiding unnecessary duels. When they did fight, they often fell back quickly after losing their first tank. The illusion of invulnerability, the cornerstone of German armored morale, had finally shattered. The laughter that echoed in briefing rooms when Allied inferior guns were mocked was gone. In its place was a silence born of realization that technology, not pride, now decided survival. And as Germany's final winter deepened, its once superior machines were being undone, not by overwhelming numbers, but by one small tungsten core the size of a thumb, a weapon forged from Allied desperation and intelligence, now rewriting the rules of tank warfare. By early 1945, Allied factories were running at full speed, but even at their peak, They couldn't produce enough HVAP ammunition to arm every tank that needed it. The M93 HVAP round had proven its worth in combat beyond any doubt. Yet in the cold mathematics of wartime industry, its greatest limitation wasn't design or doctrine, it was tungsten. Tungsten carbide, the heart of each HVAP projectile, was among the rarest strategic materials of the war. Only a handful of sources existed worldwide: Portugal, China, Burma, and Bolivia, and every ton was contested by both Axis and Allied powers. The Allies controlled most of it, but not enough to meet demand. Each M93 round required several pounds of tungsten, and that same material was also needed for machine tools, cutting heads, and aircraft engines. The result was simple but severe. For every HVAP shell produced, something else vital had to go without. By February 1945, reports from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department confirmed the bottleneck. Only select divisions such as the 704th, 601st, and 805th Tank Destroyer Battalions, along with elite Sherman units equipped with the new 76mm guns, received small allocations. Typical issue was 3 to 5 HVAP rounds per tank, sometimes fewer. Tankers often kept them in marked boxes, saving them for when the unmistakable silhouettes of a Panther or Tiger appeared on the horizon. Despite their scarcity, the rounds made an outsized impact. Field data collected from the Lorraine campaign through the Ardennes and into the Cologne and Ruhr operations revealed that vehicles equipped with HVAP achieved 30–40% higher kill ratios than those firing only standard AP rounds. Tank destroyer battalions credited HVAP with giving them back the offensive, enabling ambushes and long-range duels they would have once avoided. Commanders began structuring their tactics around these limited rounds, assigning HVAP-equipped vehicles to overwatch positions or key choke points. But for all its tactical success, HVAP never reached the scale of mass adoption. Tungsten, again, was the ceiling. By late March 1945, American ordnance officers reluctantly shifted focus toward post-war substitutes, ideas for high-velocity, full-caliber steel penetrators or chemical energy warheads that wouldn't rely on scarce metals. Nevertheless, on the front lines, the few tungsten rounds in circulation continued to shape outcomes. In March 1945, during the push toward the Rhine, M18 Hellcats of the 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalion used HVAP to destroy multiple Panther tanks, attempting a counterattack near Remagen. After-action reports noted, enemy armor frontally penetrated at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Crews confident in ammunition performance. Even as Germany collapsed, Allied crews were still astonished by the weapon's consistency. Many began referring to HVAP as their lifesaver, or simply the silver bullet. Meanwhile, German engineers reviewing the wreckage of their own tanks recognized that no practical fix could stop it. Armor angles could be adjusted, thickness increased, but the underlying physics was now against them. A German ordnance memorandum dated March 1945 admitted bluntly, "The enemy has achieved parity in penetration and exceeded our available materials. Further armor improvement is no longer feasible." It was a quiet acknowledgement that the technological advantage had passed irreversibly to the Allies. Beyond the battlefield, HVAP also left a political footprint. Allied commanders realized that industrial access to rare elements could decide the fate of wars. The US and Britain began mapping global tungsten reserves, a precursor to the post-war strategic materials programs that would continue into the Cold War. And within the factories of Aberdeen, Watervliet, and Frankfurt Arsenal, engineers who had once doubted the feasibility of tungsten cord shells now worked on the next generation, ideas that would evolve into APCR, armor piercing, composite rigid, and eventually APDS, armor piercing, discarding sabot rounds used in the Korean and Vietnam wars. The HVAP had done more than save lives on the battlefield. It had opened a doorway into the future of armor-piercing science, but its story was not yet finished. The end of the war would reveal the final irony, that both sides had walked the same technological path. Only one had the resources to finish it. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins, but inside laboratories, workshops, and proving grounds, the war's true legacy was only beginning. The HVAP round, born out of desperation and scarcity, had proven a decisive technological step, not because it won the war alone, but because it revealed the new face of modern warfare. The supremacy of material science. In the months following Germany's surrender, American and British ordnance teams moved quickly to capture and analyze every piece of German weapons research they could find. Among the blueprints recovered were detailed documents on Panzer 40 tungsten core ammunition, Panzer 41 taper bore shells, and experimental discarding sabot projectiles, all evidence that Germany had once pursued the same ideas that HVAP represented. The irony was stark. The Reich had led the race early, but its hunger for conquest had consumed the very materials it needed to stay ahead. By 1944, German tungsten reserves were nearly exhausted, their cutting tools dull and their munitions industry crippled. In contrast, Allied industry, though stretched thin, still functioned, powered by vast logistics networks and global access to resources. Post-war, analyses conducted by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department concluded that HVAP had significantly improved tank destroyer and medium tank effectiveness, especially against heavy German armor. More importantly, it had demonstrated the potential of sub-caliber ammunition, inspiring rapid advances in the following years. Within a decade, HVAP's concept evolved into new forms. The armor-piercing discarding sabot APDS round, used by British 20-pounder and later 105mm guns. The armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot APFSDS, which would become standard in NATO tanks by the 1960s and beyond. All of these trace their ancestry to that first tungsten cord projectile tested at Aberdeen in 1943, but perhaps HVAP's greatest legacy wasn't material. It was psychological. It shattered the myth of invincibility. For years, German generals and engineers had believed their armor was unassailable and that no enemy weapon could match their craftsmanship. They underestimated not only Allied science, but Allied resolve. The M93 HVAP became proof that adaptation, not arrogance, decides survival. In countless post-war studies, historians noted how innovation often emerges not from superiority, but from necessity. The Allies didn't invent HVAP because they were ahead. They invented it because they were behind, and in that struggle, they discovered the formula that would define Cold War warfare: research, materials, and speed of adaptation. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, captured samples of HVAP and British APDS rounds deeply influenced the design of post-war Soviet tank guns and ammunition. The 85mm and 100mm guns of the late 1940s began to adopt similar sub-caliber concepts, leading eventually to the long-rod penetrators of the T-62 and T-72 series. Tungsten, once an obscure industrial metal, became a global strategic commodity, as valuable as oil or uranium. Its control was written quietly into Cold War policy. In museums today, an M93 HVAP round looks unremarkably a dull, stubby shell with a black-painted tip. Yet inside that simple casing lies the story of ingenuity forged under fire, a weapon created not for power, but for parity, not for conquest, but for survival. When German generals once laughed at Allied weapons, they laughed at what they thought was inferiority. When they stopped laughing, they realized what they were truly facing: the industrial and intellectual force of nations that refused to accept defeat. The HVAP didn't just pierce armor, it pierced the illusion that any machine, no matter how advanced, is beyond challenge. And as tanks rolled off the assembly lines into the next era from Korea to the Middle East, every shell that flew at supersonic speed carried a trace of tungsten's legacy. Born in the fires of 1944, the war for Europe ended not only in the rubble of cities or the surrender of armies. It ended in the laboratories, the workshops, and the minds of those who refused to stop thinking. The M93 HVAP round was never produced in great numbers. It did not win battles by itself, nor did it dominate headlines. Yet, its existence marked a turning point in the invisible struggle behind the front lines, the war of ideas. In 1943, Allied tank crews faced the grim reality that their weapons could not pierce German armor. By 1945, through ingenuity and desperation, they held in their hands a small tungsten shell capable of defeating the very symbol of German might, the Panther. That transformation was more than scientific. It was moral. It proved that the greatest weapon in war is not arrogance, nor numbers, nor even machinery. It is the ability to adapt faster than fear. For the German generals who once laughed at Allied guns, the laughter became an echo fading behind the roar of their own burning tanks. For Allied crews, the black-tipped HVAP round became more than ammunition. It became faith in their own ingenuity. History remembers the great machines, the Tiger, the Panther, the Sherman, but it often forgets the quiet revolutions that made victory possible. A single tungsten core, spinning at thousands of feet per second, represented the collective intelligence of an entire alliance of scientists, engineers, and soldiers united by necessity. And perhaps that is the true legacy of HVAP. That progress, even in the darkest of wars, is driven by those who refuse to accept that the enemy's armor is unbeatable. The laughter of overconfidence was silenced and replaced by the steady rhythm of innovation. And from those few silver bullets of 1944, a new age of warfare was born, one where ideas, not invincibility, would decide the course of history.